Hello there, so in this video I want to walk you through an experience I had a week ago. One of the things I do as a mapper modder guy is check qualified maps for problems. There's a whole workflow set up for this to ensure every map is checked by 2 different beatmap nominators, managed through an automatic Trello board, but I'll skip out on the details of that for now. They're not important. What matters is knowing that on a night last week, I had some time to spare and went on a map checking spree. I went through around 10 maps back to back, ensuring they didn't break the ranking criteria or have any other relevant issues. Some maps I gave a pass, while others I either disqualified or reported for potential disqualification later. Doing this can be an uninteresting task. As much as I want to say every new map is its own engaging take on a song through mapping, that just isn't true. Most maps are simply maps, aiming to do nothing more than represent the music in standard ways, and while that's perfectly fine for ranking, it can make my task rather boring. Just because it's more common than not, I expected every map I checked to be nothing special, and was more or less meeting those expectations until I went through the last map on the list. Expectations are established in more ways than one, and on Osu, I think one of the most common ways is creator bias. Even if players and mappers want to judge maps on their own merit, it's impossible to separate them from their creators when their names can say so much. Each mapper's history and previously created maps give insight into how the rest of their maps are made because of mapper habits, leading to expectations for any of their future maps. I'm sure you've all felt this too. If you liked a map from a certain mapper, you probably enjoyed other maps they made. There's not many mappers who vary enough between maps to cause different impressions. So I have expectations for mappers I'm familiar with, but also expectations for those I don't know at all. Mappers never open the editor for the first time and spit out masterpieces, meaning my expectations for anyone I've never heard of are usually low. 99 times out of 100, they're a new mapper whose map blatantly shows it, which is why when I'm shown a map from someone who I'm unfamiliar with and it's actually good, it interests me more than a good map from someone who I expect to make good maps. It's like the story of an underdog, everyone knows what I mean. The creator of the last map in my map checking spree was somewhere in between. I didn't follow him closely, so I didn't have many expectations, though I did see a few of his maps in the past. The first was most memorable because he had his username set to Anime Girl at the time, which isn't exactly a plus for the mapping. Another map of his stood out because of its visual design and type of organization. It showed me he knew what makes a map cool, or at least that we shared the same idea of cool. And the third map of his that came to mind was a marathon, whose comment section made me think most people don't really like this strict genre of mapping. Combining my expectations brought on by the situation, checking uninteresting qualified maps, with my limited knowledge of the mapper, I was rather neutral on what I was about to see in the final map here, and those expectations seemingly grew worse from my surface view of the map. I was checking the map for unrankable problems, and the first object on the map was nearly that. Only by a few pixels does it show which direction you're supposed to follow the slider, which means it's a mystery to anyone using a skin with transparent slider tails. I then opened AI mod because, automatic problem checker is useful, and saw this. Object's end is off-screen, which is a violation of the ranking criteria. However, it was actually fine. AI mod never detected the top of the screen properly, and these 2 first objects I looked at made it clear that the map creator was going for literally the edgiest thing possible. That in itself isn't necessarily bad, but expectations hit me once again. Most maps whose purpose is to be edgy do so while sacrificing musical expression, meaning I anticipated this map was going to go down that road and be terrible too. What I saw as it went on wasn't terrible though, far from it. The map's long build-up visually showed each phrase in music through their own respective patterns. It's a method of mapping I personally find most effective since through more than just a vague feeling like spacing, emphasis, and flow, it let me recognize how each combo related to the music. For a somewhat repetitive song, it also managed variety perfectly despite what comments on one of his previous maps said. It uses patterns that may be different, but still plainly communicate the same ideas. Like, compare these 2 patterns. Rather than copying and pasting the same arrangement, as I expected and as someone too focused on consistency would do, or using generic, non-recognizable patterning, as someone who finds copying, pasting it all to be a sin would do, the mapper here went with one idea, expanding sliders with triangular rotations, and implemented it with different interpretations. It's one clear idea representing one part of the music, made interesting through variable design, and that way of mapping sums up all the repetitive parts in this entire map. So in case it wasn't obvious, I liked what I was seeing. It was showing signs of what I considered a solid map, enhanced by how it was surpassing both my expectations for the circumstances, and my expectations for what I knew the mapper could create, which was admittedly limited. I later learned that this mapper was mentored by Handsome, and the design of this map specifically was inspired by YFBNP. Those are 2 of my favorite mappers, so liking this map only made sense. As I approached the map's climax, I was anticipating something really cool, some gimmick or way of mapping that truly conveyed the most engaging part of the song through objects. And the result was this. It's grid-based mapping style. Maybe it's different from normal maps, but it's been overdone in my eyes. Not in older times, I mean recently. In the past few months, a lot of mappers have attempted this grid mapping, turning it from a 1 or 2 time nostalgia-esque gimmick into yet another style used to make a map different. It's not ordinary, but it's not new or especially interesting either, so I was feeling rather disappointed by the map, especially in its climax. It raised my interest, only to lose it at what should have been its peak. And that actually worked to its benefit. After 2 musical phrases of that basic grid style, the map revealed that there was a bit more to it. The real climax came next, when the map slowly rotated the grid in one direction to represent the held synth noise's pitch change. This made me understand why the mapper went for a lame grid style. It was the best way to make the following sections even more effective. Because the grid is so rigid through right angles that are so recognizable, it actually looks like the playfield is turning when each of these small pieces are gradually rotated. And I couldn't notice it through just watching the editor, but it also feels like the section is rotating thanks to mouse drift. When doing circular movement in one direction for too long, a player's mouse can drift from its original location. It's hard to say if it's intentional even, but it feels like this perfectly aligns with the music. As the synth noise intensifies, my mouse drifts more, straining my aim in the same way the music feels strained. Then as the synth noise dies down, rotation flows in the opposite direction, resetting the mouse drift. I think the way this climax is designed both looks and feels as cool as the music necessitates, and overall I'd consider it one of my favorite maps of the year. Too bad I had to report it for a wrongly snapped slider. Not my favorite slider. But yeah, expectations. Finding a diamond in the rough when checking random qualified maps, and my limited knowledge of the mapper both made the map feel special, but more impactful to me than breaking those external expectations was breaking of internal expectations. Expectations established by the map itself. By that, I'm referring to the sensation when some mundane part of a map's design is revealed to have a more significant purpose later on. The map I've been gushing about so far made me feel that through its purposeful use of grid mapping, even if that wasn't the intent, and it's not the only map to pull that off. I was talking with another mapper recently and he brought up this pattern, explaining how he thought it was a perfect fit for the song. Specifically, he mentioned how the build-up 1/4 sliders being premeditated through the half-beat sliders before was interesting. Alone, nobody would consider the first slider special, they're just ordinary sliders, but the expanding sliders afterwards formed from the same skeleton works to follow the music perfectly, and through that, it's done in a much more interesting way than any of the other difficulties. On the small scale, this happens all the time. 2 sliders here, they look pretty arbitrary, so my expectations are low, but a second later it becomes clear that they had a purpose. Big 1-2 jumps, looks like nothing special, I expect nothing special, but they actually come together to form something unexpectedly cool. This kind of unnecessarily deliberate object choice gives me the same feeling as, like, details in movies. The feeling when one seemingly unimportant line at the beginning of a movie turns out to be important and to connect to the end of the movie. It makes me think, damn, that didn't even need to be there, but because it was, it makes the scene 10 times cooler. If you're looking for a specific example, the Game of Thrones Hodor reveal comes to mind, but I'm not about to spoil that here. Of course, this isn't the kind of thing everyone values in mapping compared to movies. In last week's video, I said my way of mapping underwent a facelift 2 years ago, and I know the me before then wouldn't even notice this. My maps back then had no distinct or purposeful patterns, so that eventually made me uninterested in them. As I learned more about mapping, I realized the maps that stood out the most to me were the ones that had these expectation-breaking mini-movie detail-like reveals within each pattern, and that led my own mapping to take on a similarly deliberate style. Maybe the best way to describe it is an admiration for this type of mapping itself, since only once you try mapping do you appreciate what kind of work it takes to make maps with more than just the simplest patterns that still follow the music. Your expectations for what goes into a map change, and that can affect how you map. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about why I thought this map was cool. We're done here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.